Everybody, welcome to my version of this discussion on the Kansas school-based funding formula. And let's get right into it. Well, first of all, the Kansas Constitution mandates that the state provide for public education. If you'll notice in Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution, it states the legislature shall make suitable provision for the educational interest of the state. Also, in the Rose versus Council for Better Education case, which actually came from the Kentucky courts but has been cited as precedent in Kansas, the courts in Kentucky and the Kansas courts have picked up on this and ruled likewise. They ruled as follows. It is a state obligation to provide substantially equal education to all children. As to funding, we state only that the General Assembly, that is the legislature, must provide adequate funding for the system. How they do this is their decision. So again, that ruling came from the Kentucky state courts. However, in the Gannon v. State of Kansas ruling, here in this state, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that the state of Kansas too must also follow that directive. Provide substantially equal education and provide adequate funding for the system. So how do they do that? Well, every year, the Kansas legislature sets a per pupil amount of funding. The highest it's ever been in 1998 and 1999 was $4,400 per pupil weighted. Now, I'm going to explain what that weighted means in just a minute. But at any rate, in 1998 and 9, when the school funding amount hit its peak, it was $4,400 per pupil. Now, when this formula was first written, back about 10 years before that, the original goal was to max out at $4,492. So it got within $92 of that at its peak. But it has fallen since then because of the tough economy after the economic recession of 2008 and because of tax cuts that have left the state with less revenue than we were anticipating. The economic growth provoked by those tax cuts has not worked out as well as had been hoped, so there have had to be cuts in that amount. So for 2013-14, these are fiscal years. They tend to start in the middle of the calendar year. So for 2013-2014, a year which is now over because we're now in fiscal year 2015 as of November 2014, the amount was $3,838 per pupil. But again, that is weighted. So you'll note the downward trend here in the spending. But what is this weighting all about? Well, one student may count as more than one full-time equivalency student due to weighting. That is to say, they take the number of students, but for certain students, each student counts as more than one. A student might count as 1.1 student or 1.05 student because they add these weighting factors in to give additional weight in the formula to factors like students on free or reduced priced lunches, students with special needs, and students in rural areas which have higher transportation costs. These and a host of other factors, and there are a lot of them, all are used to weight the formula so that additional credit is given to school districts that have more students in these and other categories, which can lead to higher costs on the school districts. Other factors which are not on this slide can include things like students that do not speak English as their first language. Again, extra weighting factors are placed in the formula because it costs more to educate certain students, and therefore extra credit is given in the formula so that the school district gets extra money. So after we take the number of pupils and then we look at the weighting factors and the number of pupils to whom each of the weighting factors applies, and these weights get very, very complicated, by the way, and the state legislature is always changing the weighting factors. This is where the complexity and confusion comes into the Kansas school-based funding formula, is the weights. Everything else is pretty straightforward, but the weighting can be very, very complicated. But once it's done, we then move on to raising the revenue. Now we've got the number of pupils times the per pupil amount times the weights. But where are we going to get the money? Well, it starts with a minimum 20 mil property tax levy. A mil means 1/10 of a penny. And it is Kansas state law that every school district in the state levy at least 20 mills or 2 cents of property taxes per dollar of assessed value in order to raise money for its schools. Now, before the early 1990s, it was 35 mills, so it was cut significantly, because what happened in the early 1990s is this school-based funding formula was instituted so that more money comes from the state general revenues, which in turn come from sales and income taxes primarily, and a few other things too. And that way, the goal is to level up the disparity between the amount of money from property taxes that rich school districts can raise versus the amount of money that poor school districts can raise, and to help level it out. So they reduce the dependence on property taxes and increase the amount of money from the state general revenues going into the schools. So this was a major cut in the property tax levy, but it was offset by more money coming from state general revenues. Now, the first $20,000 of value of property is exempt, so that a less expensive piece of property may not be taxed at all, or it may be taxed at a lower rate. So a $40,000 house would only be taxed for $20,000, because you'd take the first $20,000 and deduct it, and you only have a remainder of $20,000 that the tax would be placed upon. And this is for residential property. Property taxes can be handled a number of different ways. Property can be classified a number of different ways. That can include residential property, but also commercial property where businesses operate, industrial property where industries can operate, agricultural, of course, farming. This 20 mil property tax levy is for residential property. It's different if the property is zoned for something other than residential use. It may still be taxed, but at a different rate. Now, here's the key. So look at these two triangles. As you can see, the triangle on the left represents a wealthy school district, such as the Blue Valley School District in Johnson County. And in that district, the school district can generate a lot of revenue just based on these property taxes, because the property values are higher. And remember from my lecture on property taxes that the higher the property value, the more the property tax is collected, no matter what the tax rate is, because it's the assessed value times the levy, which gets you the amount of money owed in property taxes. So in homes in southern Johnson County, many of which are worth more than $200 a piece, you've got a higher assessed value, so no matter what your levy is, you're going to raise a lot more money for the schools and other things like libraries and community colleges and such. But most property tax money goes to the schools. You're going to get a lot more property tax when the property assessed value is higher. In the lower income school district, you raise a good deal less. Look at the triangle on the right with all that empty space above the green. These school districts may have the same or even higher levies. School districts are allowed to raise the levy above the 20 mil minimum. We'll get to that in a minute when we do local option budgets. But right now, let's just say that no matter what the levy is, if the assessed value of the property in your school district is a lot lower, then you're not going to raise as much money. So you'll see the big gap there that needs to be filled to get up to the amount of money appropriated for the school district. So how do we get all that additional money, especially for the less wealthy school district? Well, the answer is redistribution. Residents of wealthier communities pay taxes, and a good deal of that money goes into the school funding formula, which in turn helps the lower income schools more than the upper income schools. And this is how it works. Oops, that's the local option budget. I skipped one. Let me go back here. So the state tops off the local revenues. In other words, you see that empty part of the two triangles. That is the shortfall between how much money the school district raised through its property taxes and how much money the state says they are supposed to have. And the lower income district needs more money. So the state puts the money in from general revenues. Again, that's mostly sales and income taxes that fund that. Again, it is a redistributive formula, but not only that, but some school districts in the state, such as the ones in Johnson County and also Lawrence, they would like to spend more than the minimum. They're willing to tax themselves on their property at a higher rate than the 20 mil minimum if they can put that into their own schools. So the question is, are they allowed to do that? And the answer is yes, under certain circumstances. The local option budget, otherwise known as the LOB, gives schools the right to raise property taxes higher than the minimum and put additional money into their schools. However, there is a cap on the LOB, and the cap is somewhat complicated. If a school district is in the top 25% wealthiest school districts as classified by the state, then the school district is on their own for raising extra money for their schools. They can go up to 25% over the base amount, but all that money has to be raised locally. If, on the other hand, a school district is in the bottom 75% of school districts in the state as classified by wealth, then not only can they raise an LOB up to 25% over the minimum, again coming from property taxes higher than the minimum mill levy, but not only that, but if they're in the bottom 75% for wealth, then the state will match their LOB money through a state formula. So the wealthier school districts are on their own for LOB. The less wealthy school districts get a state match if they're willing to put additional money into the schools by raising property tax levies higher than the 20 mil minimum. However, the cap is 25% over the base state per pupil amount. No school district in the state can raise locally more money than that. And so there are school districts in Johnson County, for example, which would love to raise the amount they get from their own property taxes even higher, pay more property taxes and put it into their own schools, but the state cap prevents from doing that. And the argument is, again, back to this redistribution, that what this formula does is tie the wealthier school districts, especially in Johnson County, to the state formula. So the only way they get more money for their schools is if the entire state formula is increased on the per pupil amount and all the schools get more money, rather than taking the cap off and letting them raise unlimited money locally, put it into their own schools, but that does nothing for the rest of the state, especially the less wealthy school districts. So that again reinforces the redistribution, and the LOB cap is not popular in Johnson County. Now finally, the 2014 Gannon decision, which required the state to put more money into the schools, also made a distinction between capital and operating expenditures. Capital expenditures refers to expenditures on facilities, things like buildings, for example. If you build a new building or renovate a building, that's a capital expenditure. Operating expenditures are what pay for you to run day to day. Things like the teachers' salaries, for example, and the staff salaries. In the Gannon decision, the courts made it clear that money budgeted for capital expenditures, building improvements and such, cannot be diverted to operating budgets. The operating budget is what the school-based funding formula refers to, and that money is supposed to be kept separate. There is no cap on how much money school districts can raise for capital expenditures, so some wealthy school districts in the state, for example, have beautiful facilities but have trouble raising enough money to pay the teachers in those facilities because of this separateness from capital expenditures, which are not capped, versus operating budgets, which are capped. And you can't move money over from the capital budget to shore up the operating budget, according to the 2014 Gannon decision. Now, as I record this, it is Election Day 2014, and this is one of the biggest issues, the school funding formula in general, one of the biggest issues that is affecting the race, especially for governor. The governor has championed these income tax cuts and would eventually like to phase out the income tax in Kansas altogether, but that has necessitated cuts to the base per pupil state aid formula, which are not popular with public school supporters and, of course, with teachers' organizations. And so his opponent, Paul Davis, has argued that the tax cuts are costing the schools too much. Now, the governor has countered that he has offered the school districts grants instead of increased base per pupil state aid, and that he has shored up the state pension system, which is for teachers, among others. And that is true. However, the question is, will the policies the governor champions still have this redistributive function of closing the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest school districts, because those grants aren't specifically designed to top up and make sure that there's not as big of a gap. In fact, the school-based funding formula in Kansas, as the school-based funding formula is in Kentucky and many other states, all came from lawsuits which were arguing that it was a violation of the state constitution to have such a big gap between the property tax revenues in wealthy school districts and the property tax revenues in poor school districts. Before the current funding formula was written, the wealthiest school districts in the state had up to 3 times as much money per pupil as the poorest ones. And the purpose of the school funding formula was to equalize that. It doesn't make it completely equal, because we still have, for example, the local option budgets, which are used more by wealthier school districts than by less wealthy ones, but at least it gets it a lot closer. Cutting this base per pupil state aid, you see the decline here, means that there is less money available for this kind of equalizing. And so that's one of the big controversies in the election. As you watch this, the election will be just over, and we'll see how it turns out. But this gives you a basic primer, not only on the Kansas school-based funding formula, but on the topic of school-based funding formulas in general. Again, the basic idea is to raise money from a property tax minimum levy and then top up the rest of the money that schools need to get their base per pupil state aid with money from state general revenues. And that requires a lot more for less wealthy than more wealthy school districts. And the primary complicating factor is the weighting, because a pupil is not always a pupil. One pupil can count as more than one if they meet any of these or a number of other categories that involve needing additional support from the state. And finally, in Kansas, as in many states, the capital and the operating expenditures are supposed to be kept separate. So there you have it, the Kansas school-based funding formula.